Close your eyes. Let the tensions of the modern world slip away like water through open fingers. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, through centuries of noise and progress, through ages of technology and electric light, until you reach a quieter world. A world of stone and candlelight, of narrow streets and vast horizons. It is the early 13th century. You are standing on a hillside in the south of what we now call France, though no one here would recognize that name. This is the Languedoc, the land of the Languedoc, the language of yes spoken as oc rather than the northern oil. The evening air is warm against your skin, fragrant with wild thyme and lavender. Below you, a valley spreads out in shades of purple and gold as the sun descends toward distant hills. In the village below, smoke rises from cooking fires. You can hear, faintly, the sound of evening bells from the church tower. But there is another sound too if you listen carefully. Voices, gentle and earnest, speaking in hushed tones. A small group has gathered in a modest house, its windows shuttered against prying eyes. They are praying, but not in Latin. They are praying in their own tongue, the language of their mothers and fathers, the language of their hearts. These people call themselves simply the good Christians, or the good men and good women. Their neighbors call them the bons hommes and bonnes femmes. But the Catholic Church in Rome and the bishops who serve it have another name for them. They call them Cathars, from the Greek word katharos, meaning pure, and the Church calls them heretics, the most dangerous heretics in all of Christendom. This is their story, a story of faith and doubt, of love and terrible violence, of a spiritual movement that challenged the most powerful institution in medieval Europe and paid a price so terrible that it would echo through the centuries. It is a story largely forgotten, deliberately obscured, carefully buried beneath layers of propaganda and silence. But the truth, like water seeping through stone, eventually finds its way to the light. The Cathars did not call themselves by that name. They were not, in their own eyes, members of a separate religion at all. They believed they were the truest Christians, the ones who actually followed the teachings of Jesus Christ without compromise, without corruption, without the accumulated weight of centuries of human politics and greed. They looked at the Catholic Church of their time and saw something that disturbed them deeply. They saw bishops who lived in palaces while peasants starved. They saw priests who demanded tithes and taxes, who owned vast estates, who concerned themselves more with earthly power than heavenly truth. They saw the veneration of physical objects, relics and crosses and images, which seemed to them like a return to pagan idol worship. They saw a church that blessed armies and sanctified wars, that claimed to follow a Prince of Peace while drenching Europe in blood. And so they asked a simple, dangerous question. What if this church is wrong? The Languedoc, where they flourished, was a special place in medieval Europe. While much of the continent languished under feudal tyranny and ignorance, this corner of the world had developed something approaching a small renaissance. The troubadours, those wandering poet-musicians, had made this region famous across Europe for its culture of courtly love and sophisticated verse. Trade routes connected the cities of the Languedoc to the Mediterranean world, bringing not just goods but ideas, philosophies, questions. The nobility here were different too. The counts and viscounts of the south had developed a more relaxed, more tolerant approach to governance than their counterparts in the north. Women could inherit property, own land, conduct business. Nobles and merchants alike valued education and debate. Jews lived in relative peace in many towns, contributing to the commercial and intellectual life of the region. And when these new good Christians emerged, preaching their austere but appealing version of the faith, many nobles protected them, respected them, even converted to their beliefs. This tolerance, this openness to different ideas, would ultimately seal the Languedoc's fate. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in this twilight hour on this hillside, the catastrophe still lies in the future. In the village below, the good Christians continue their evening prayer. They have no priests, no elaborate rituals, no golden chalices or jeweled vestments. They have only their faith, their community, and their conviction that they have found a purer path to God. One of them, a man named Pierre, speaks softly to the others. He is what they call a parfait, a perfect one, someone who has taken the most serious vows of their faith. He owns nothing, eats no meat, speaks no lies, harms no living thing. He has renounced all the pleasures of the flesh, all the attachments of the material world. His face, lit by candlelight, shows both the strain of his ascetic life and a kind of quiet radiance, a peace that comes from absolute conviction. He reminds the gathered believers that this world, this physical realm of suffering and death, is not their true home. He tells them that within each person is a divine spark, a fragment of the true God, trapped in corrupt matter. The goal of life, he explains, is to free that spark, to return it to the realm of light from which it came. This physical world, with all its pain and injustice, is the creation of a false god, a demiurge, the God of the Old Testament who demands blood sacrifice and wages war. The true God, the God of Jesus Christ, would never create such a world of suffering. The true God is pure spirit, pure love, pure light. And one day, Pierre tells them, they will return to that light. One day, they will be free. The listeners nod quietly. Some are simple peasants, others are wealthy merchants. One is even a minor nobleman. In this room, such distinctions matter less. What matters is the shared belief, the shared hope, the shared certainty that they have found something true in a world of lies. None of them know, on this peaceful evening, what is coming. None of them can imagine that within a few decades, this entire civilization will be drowned in blood. That armies from the north will descend upon these hills like wolves upon sheep. That a new kind of institution, called the Inquisition, will be created specifically to hunt them down. That thousands upon thousands of their brothers and sisters will be burned alive, their ashes scattered to the winds, their names erased from history. But tonight they do not know this. Tonight there is only the prayer, the community, the faith. The candles flicker in the gentle evening breeze coming through the shutters. Outside, the stars are beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that have watched over humanity since the beginning, that will continue watching long after all these people and their stories have turned to dust. Let us watch with them. Let us follow this story where it leads, into darkness and light, into horror and heroism, into one of the most tragic and misunderstood chapters of European history. The Cathars are waiting to tell us their truth, and we, at last, are ready to listen. Chapter 2. The Good Christians of the South. To understand who the Cathars were, we must first understand what they believed. This is more difficult than it might seem, because almost all of our sources about Cathar belief come from their enemies. The Cathars themselves left very few written records. They believed that material things, including books and documents, were part of the corrupt physical world. What mattered was the living transmission of faith, teacher to student, perfect one to believer, spirit to spirit. What we know of their beliefs comes largely from the records of the Inquisition, from the testimonies of captured Cathars forced to explain their faith to hostile interrogators, and from the writings of Catholic polemicists who sought to refute and condemn them. Imagine trying to understand a religion by reading only the transcripts of its adherents under torture, or the propaganda of its most bitter enemies. That is the challenge historians face with Catharism. Yet despite this distortion, certain core beliefs emerge with clarity. The Cathars were dualists. This means they believed in two gods, two cosmic principles locked in eternal struggle. There was the true God, the God of the New Testament, who is pure spirit, perfect love, infinite light. And there was the false God, the Rex Mundi, or King of the World, who had created the physical universe as a prison for souls. This dualist theology had ancient roots. It echoed Gnostic Christianity from the early centuries of the Church, beliefs that had been suppressed and condemned by the Orthodox Fathers. It resonated with Manichaeism, the religion of the Persian prophet Mani, which had once spread from China to Spain before being crushed by both Christian and Muslim authorities. Some scholars believe that Cathar missionaries came from the Bogomils, dualist Christians in the Balkans who held similar beliefs. In the Cathar understanding of the universe, a great tragedy had occurred before the creation of the physical world. The Rex Mundi, a fallen angel or perhaps an evil deity who had always existed, had somehow trapped a portion of the true God's spiritual essence. He had then created the material world as a prison for these divine sparks, clothing them in flesh, binding them to matter, making them forget their true nature. Every human being, according to this belief, was one of these imprisoned spirits. Inside each person was a fragment of the divine, yearning to return home, but trapped in the corruption of physical existence. The goal of the spiritual life was to remember one's true nature, to reject the material world and its false god, and eventually to escape the cycle of reincarnation and return to the realm of pure spirit. Yes, reincarnation. This was one of the most shocking aspects of Cathar belief to the Catholic Church. The Cathars taught that if a soul did not achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, it would be reborn again and again, perhaps in human form, perhaps even in animal form, until it finally learned to reject the material world entirely. This explained the suffering and injustice of earthly life. We were all serving sentences in a cosmic prison, learning slowly and painfully to desire our freedom. The Catholic Church taught that Christ had died on the cross to redeem humanity from sin. The Cathars had a different interpretation. They did not believe that Jesus Christ had a physical body at all. How could the divine take on corrupt flesh? Instead, Christ was a purely spiritual being, an avatar of the true God, who had appeared to humans in the semblance of a body to teach them the way to escape the material prison. His crucifixion was an illusion. The true message of Christ was not about blood sacrifice, but about gnosis, knowledge, the remembrance of our divine nature. You can imagine how this sounded to Catholic ears. The Church's entire theology was built on the Incarnation, the belief that God had literally become flesh in Jesus Christ. The Eucharist, the central sacrament of Catholic worship, depended on the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the bread and wine. If Christ had no real body, the whole elaborate structure of Catholic belief collapsed. The Cathars rejected nearly all Catholic sacraments. Baptism with water was useless, they taught, because water was material. The Eucharist was worse than useless. It was almost blasphemous to claim that God could be present in a piece of bread. Marriage was a trap, because it led to procreation, which created more prisons for souls in the form of new human bodies. The veneration of the cross was perverse, they said. Would you worship the gallows where your loved one had been hanged? Instead of these material sacraments, the Cathars had one central ritual, which they called the consolamentum. This was a form of spiritual baptism, performed not with water but through the laying on of hands. When a believer received the consolamentum, usually after years of preparation, they became one of the perfect ones, the parfaits or parfaits. They took vows of poverty, celibacy, and nonviolence. They agreed to eat no meat, cheese, eggs, or any food that came from sexual reproduction. They would spend the rest of their lives wandering from town to town, teaching, praying, living by charity, preparing their souls for the final liberation. Not all Cathars took these extreme vows. In fact, most did not. The majority were ordinary believers called credentes, who lived normal lives, married, had children, pursued their trades. They attended the preaching of the perfect ones. They provided them with food and shelter. They revered them as living saints. But they did not yet take on the full rigors of the ascetic life. Many credentes planned to receive the consolamentum only on their deathbed, so they could achieve salvation without having to endure years of severe asceticism. The Cathars also had a very different view of gender than mainstream medieval society. Women could become perfect ones just as men could. The parfaits, the female perfects, had the same spiritual authority as their male counterparts. They could preach, they could administer the consolamentum, they could lead communities. In a medieval world where women were systematically excluded from religious authority, this was revolutionary. Many noble women of the Languedoc became Cathars. Some established houses where groups of parfaits lived together in communities, praying and teaching. These houses became centers of learning and spirituality. The ethical life of the perfect ones was, by any measure, extraordinarily rigorous. They took the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," to its logical extreme. They would not kill animals for food, nor harm any creature. They would not swear oaths, following Christ's teaching in the Gospel of Matthew. They wandered in pairs, usually, traveling from village to village on foot, depending on the charity of believers. They wore simple, dark robes. They carried nothing but perhaps a small book containing the Gospel of John. To the common people of the Languedoc, these perfect ones seemed like living saints. They were kind, gentle, humble. They lived the poverty that Catholic priests preached but rarely practiced. They were willing to explain the faith in the people's own language. They did not demand tithes or taxes. They did not threaten hellfire for minor sins. Instead, they offered hope. The hope that this suffering world was not all there was, that beyond the pain and injustice lay a realm of pure light and love. It is not hard to understand why, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Catharism spread through the Languedoc like a spring wind through winter grass. In some towns, it seemed that nearly everyone was either a Cathar or sympathetic to the Cathars. The Church in Rome watched this development with growing alarm. At first, they tried persuasion, but these missions largely failed. The Cathars were often better educated than the Catholic clergy, more skilled in debate, more familiar with Scripture, and their lives matched their teachings. The Church decided that more drastic measures were needed. If persuasion would not work, perhaps force would. If the heretics would not convert, perhaps they could be compelled. If they could not be compelled, perhaps they could be destroyed. The twilight deepens over our hillside. In the village below, the prayer meeting has ended. The perfect ones depart silently into the night. The believers return to their homes, to their families, to their ordinary lives made somehow more bearable by the promise of liberation. They do not hear yet the distant thunder of approaching war. Chapter 3. A dualist dream in a Catholic world. To understand why the Catholic Church responded to the Cathars with such fury, we must place ourselves in the mind of medieval Christendom. This requires setting aside our modern assumptions about religious tolerance, about the separation of church and state, about pluralism and diversity of belief. The medieval world had a very different understanding of truth, society, and salvation. In the 13th century, Europe understood itself as Christendom, a single religious civilization under the authority of the Pope in Rome. There was no concept of secular society as we know it. Kings ruled by divine right, bishops wielded political power, and theology was not a private matter of personal conscience, but the foundation of all social order. To be European was to be Christian, and to be Christian meant belonging to the Catholic Church. In this worldview, heresy was not simply a different opinion about religious matters. Heresy was a disease, a corruption, a cancer in the body of Christ that could spread and destroy the entire Christian community if left untreated. Heresy was also treason, a betrayal not just of God, but of the social order itself. A society that tolerated heresy, medieval thinkers believed, invited God's wrath upon itself. Moreover, the Church genuinely believed that heretics were damning themselves to eternal hellfire. From the Church's perspective, using force to suppress heresy was an act of mercy, both to save the heretic's soul and to prevent them from leading others to damnation. It was better for a few to suffer or die in this world than for thousands to burn forever in the next. This logic seems strange to us, perhaps monstrous, but it was sincerely held by many intelligent, devout people of the time. They were not, in their own minds, acting from cruelty or greed. They were defending truth itself, defending the salvation of souls, defending civilization from chaos. The Cathars, from the Catholic perspective, were particularly dangerous heretics because their beliefs struck at the very foundations of Christian theology. If the God of the Old Testament was evil, then the entire Hebrew Bible was the work of a demon. If Christ had no physical body, then the incarnation never happened. If the material world was evil, then God's creation was a mistake or a crime. If reincarnation was real, then Christ's sacrifice was meaningless. Every major doctrine of Catholic Christianity was challenged or denied by Cathar belief. Furthermore, if the Cathars were right, then the Catholic Church was not merely mistaken, but was actively serving the Rex Mundi, the false god, the devil. The Church, with its wealth and power, its involvement in worldly politics, its material sacraments and physical rituals, all of this aligned it with the forces of evil in the Cathar cosmology. Yet despite this fundamental opposition, for many decades the Cathars and Catholics had coexisted in the Languedoc with relatively little violence. The key to this coexistence was the attitude of the secular nobility. The counts and viscounts of the Languedoc had developed a tradition of relative independence from both the French crown in the north and the papacy in Rome. The Count of Toulouse, the most powerful noble in the region, ruled territories nearly as large as the French king's domain. These southern lords valued the prosperity that trade and relative peace brought to their lands. They had little interest in religious persecution that might disrupt commerce and create instability. Many of these nobles had Cathar relatives, friends, or vassals. Some were believers themselves, though often quietly, awaiting the consolamentum on their deathbeds. Others remained Catholic but respected the Cathars as devout, harmless people who contributed to the moral life of the community. This aristocratic tolerance was incomprehensible and infuriating to the Church. From Rome's perspective, the nobles of the Languedoc were failing in their fundamental duty to protect the faith. They were allowing heresy to flourish, even encouraging it through their indifference. The Church first tried diplomatic pressure. Papal legates were sent to the Languedoc to negotiate with the nobles, to threaten them with excommunication if they did not suppress the heresy. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse in particular proved a frustratingly slippery character. He would make promises to the legates, then fail to keep them. The Church also tried intellectual combat. In 1167, a major Cathar council had been held at Saint-Félix de Caraman, near Toulouse, openly and without interference. This was not a secret sect hiding in cellars, but an alternative church organizing itself in broad daylight. In response, Catholic authorities organized formal debates where Cathar and Catholic theologians would argue their positions before audiences. But the judges declared the outcome ambiguous. No mass conversions followed. The Cathars remained unshaken in their faith. It became clear to Rome that neither persuasion nor diplomatic pressure would work. The heresy was too deeply rooted, too well protected, too appealing to the people. More drastic measures would be necessary. But the Church had a problem. It had no army. Popes could excommunicate, they could threaten spiritual penalties, but they could not themselves wage war. For that, they needed secular rulers willing to fight on the Church's behalf. They needed a crusade. The concept of crusade had been developed in the late 11th century, when Pope Urban II called for a military expedition to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. By the early 13th century, several crusades had been launched against external enemies of Christendom. But the idea of crusading against heretics within Christian Europe was newer and more controversial. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, decided the answer was yes. Innocent was one of the most powerful and ambitious popes in history, a skilled lawyer and political operator who believed the papacy should have supreme authority over all Christian rulers. He saw the Cathar heresy not just as a theological problem, but as a direct challenge to papal power. Innocent pressured the King of France, Philip II Augustus, to take action against the heretics in the south. Philip was reluctant. His attention was focused on his conflicts with England. Besides, the Languedoc was not technically part of his kingdom. An invasion of the south would be expensive, difficult, and might fail. The breakthrough came in 1208, with an act of violence that would change everything. The Pope's call went out across France and beyond. In castles and towns across the north, knights began to prepare. They would take up the cross against the heretics. They would purify the land with fire and sword. A storm was coming, and in its wake, the Languedoc would be transformed into a wasteland, and the Cathars would be driven to the very edge of extinction. Chapter 4. The Perfect and the Believers. Before the storm breaks, before the armies arrive and the fires are lit, let us understand more deeply who these Cathars were as human beings. Not as theological abstractions or heretical statistics, but as people who loved and feared, who raised children and tended gardens, who made their way through life trying to find meaning in a world of uncertainty. The life of a Cathar believer, a credens, was not dramatically different from that of a Catholic neighbor. They woke at dawn to the same roosters, worked the same fields, haggled in the same markets. They might attend Catholic Mass on Sunday morning, then slip away in the evening to hear a perfect one preach in someone's barn. This dual practice was common and not seen as hypocritical. A believer might work as a weaver in Albi or a merchant in Toulouse, or a farmer in the countryside around Carcassonne. They might be wealthy or poor, noble or common. What united them was not social class, but a shared spiritual seeking, a feeling that the Catholic Church's answers were insufficient. When a perfect one came to town, believers would gather to hear them preach. These sermons were not thunderous condemnations of sin, not threats of hellfire and damnation. Instead, they were gentle explanations of the Cathar cosmology, reminders that this world's sufferings were temporary, that the true home of the soul was elsewhere. After the sermon, there was often a ceremony called the Milioramentum. Believers would approach the perfect one, kneel or bow deeply 3 times and say, "Bless us, good Lord. Pray God for us that He lead us to a good end." The perfect would respond with a blessing. For the perfect ones themselves, life was far more rigorous. Having received the consolamentum, they had entered into a state of spiritual perfection that required constant vigilance. Every action, every word, every thought must be aligned with their vows. They lived in a state that might be compared to monastic life, but without the safety and structure of a monastery. A perfect named Bernard might wake before dawn in whatever house had sheltered him for the night. He would pray, meditating on the Gospel of John. He would eat a simple breakfast of bread and fruit, careful to consume nothing that came from animal reproduction. He would check that his companion, perhaps a fellow perfect named Guillaume, was ready for the day's journey. They would set out on foot, walking from village to village. They might carry a small bundle with a change of clothing and a gospel book, but little else. They depended entirely on the charity of believers. This was not begging in the ordinary sense, because the perfects provided something in return: spiritual guidance, blessings, the administration of the consolamentum to those who were ready. When they reached a village, word would quickly spread. The good men have arrived. A family would offer them lodging. Others would come in the evening to hear them speak. The perfects would preach, answer questions, give blessings. If someone was dying and wished to receive the consolamentum, they would perform the ceremony. The female perfects, the parfaits, often lived in small communities, shared dwellings where they could live together in spiritual fellowship. These houses became important centers of Cathar life. Young women, particularly from noble families, would come to learn from the parfaits. The parfaits were often more educated than their Catholic counterparts. Because Catharism emphasized personal understanding of Scripture, rather than obedience to clerical authority, literacy was valued. Both male and female perfects could often read, and some could read Latin as well as the vernacular. But life as a perfect was not only rigorous but dangerous, and becoming more so as the Church's persecution intensified. By the early 1200s, bishops were offering rewards for information about perfects in their territories. Occasionally, a perfect would be arrested, interrogated, given a chance to recant, and if they refused, handed over to secular authorities for punishment. The usual punishment was burning. Most refused. The perfects believed that to recant would be to betray their divine spark. Better to die in the flesh, which was temporary and illusory, than to betray the spirit, which was eternal and real. They went to the flames praying, sometimes singing hymns, sometimes simply silent. Family life in a Cathar household might look surprisingly normal. A husband might be Catholic while his wife was a believer. Parents might be believers while their adult children remained in the church. These divisions did not necessarily tear families apart. Religion was important, but so were blood ties and affection. and violence was coming. By the spring of 1209, everyone in the Languedoc knew that a crusade had been called. Some nobles prepared to resist. The perfect ones, counseling non-violence as always, could only pray and prepare their souls. The believers looked to their lords for protection, and to their faith for courage. The last summer of the old Languedoc is fading. Autumn is coming, with its chill winds and darkening days. And with it, the crusade. Chapter 5. The Pope's Growing Shadow. To understand the catastrophe that was about to engulf the Languedoc, we must understand the man who set it in motion, Pope Innocent III, born Lotario dei Conti di Segni, one of the most powerful and consequential popes in the history of the Catholic Church. Innocent came to the papacy in 1198 at the remarkably young age of 37. He was a trained lawyer, a skilled diplomat, and a man of unshakable conviction that the Pope should be not just the spiritual head of Christendom, but its supreme political authority as well. Kings and emperors, in Innocent's view, derived their legitimacy from God through the Pope. They were like the moon, he said, reflecting the sun's light, and the sun was the papacy. This was an exalted vision of papal power, and Innocent pursued it relentlessly throughout his 18-year reign. He intervened in disputes between kingdoms, deposed unworthy rulers, placed entire nations under interdict, a kind of spiritual quarantine where no sacraments could be performed. He was, without question, one of the most formidable politicians of the Middle Ages. But Innocent was not merely power-hungry. He genuinely believed he was acting for the salvation of souls and the good of Christendom. He saw the Church as humanity's only hope, the sole institution that could bring order to a chaotic world and guide souls to salvation. And he saw threats to the Church everywhere, in the Muslim conquests in the Holy Land, in the ambitions of emperors, in the corruption of clergy, and most dangerously, in heresy. Innocent III inherited the problem of the Cathars from his predecessor, but he approached it with far greater urgency and determination. Early in his papacy, he sent letters to the nobles and bishops of the Languedoc, demanding action against the heretics. These letters grew increasingly angry and threatening as it became clear that the local authorities were not going to comply. In one letter to Count Raymond VI, Innocent wrote with barely contained fury about the spread of heresy in Raymond's lands. The Pope compared the heretics to foxes destroying the vineyard of the Lord, to wolves scattering the flock. He accused Raymond of being worse than a Saracen, worse than an infidel, because at least the Muslims were honestly opposed to Christianity, while Raymond pretended to be Christian while sheltering Christ's enemies. These were not idle words. Innocent genuinely believed that heresy was the worst sin imaginable, worse than murder, worse even than infidelity. A murderer might kill the body, but a heretic poisoned the soul, and a ruler who tolerated heresy was complicit in the damnation of thousands. The Pope tried multiple approaches before resorting to crusade. He sent preachers, he organized debates, he offered incentives for conversion. He also developed new methods of rooting out heresy, including the use of special inquisitors with expanded powers to investigate and punish. These early inquisitors were the prototypes for the later medieval Inquisition that would become infamous. But in the Languedoc, even these measures had limited effect. The heresy was too widespread, too deeply rooted, too well protected. Innocent came to believe that only war could solve the problem. Not a war of conquest for territory, though that would be its result, but a war of purification, a holy war to cleanse Christendom of its internal enemies. The murder of Pierre de Castelnau in 1208 provided the justification Innocent needed. Whatever the truth of who ordered the killing, the Pope seized on it as proof that the situation in the Languedoc had become intolerable. Negotiation had failed. Persuasion had failed. The time had come for the sword. When Innocent issued the call for crusade, he framed it in the most powerful spiritual terms available to medieval Christianity. Those who took up the cross would receive full remission of their sins, the same reward offered to crusaders going to Jerusalem. This was extraordinary. The Pope was saying that killing heretics in France was spiritually equivalent to fighting Muslims for control of the Holy Land. More than that, Innocent offered material incentives. Land conquered from excommunicated lords could be kept by the conquerors. Debts could be suspended for the duration of the crusade. The property and persons of crusaders would be under the special protection of the church while they were on campaign. For 40 days of military service, a knight could gain heaven and possibly an estate. The response was overwhelming. Knights from across northern France, from Germany, from regions as far as England, took the cross. Some were genuinely pious men who believed they were serving God. Others were younger sons with no inheritance, seeing an opportunity for land and advancement. Many were probably a mix of both motives, as humans usually are when presented with an opportunity that serves both conscience and self-interest. The church appointed Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux, and the head of the Cistercian order, to lead the crusade spiritually. Military leadership would be divided among various lords, with no single commander. This would prove to be both a strength and a weakness. The crusade could not be stopped by defeating one leader, but it also lacked unified strategic direction and often acted through chaotic violence rather than coordinated campaign. Arnaud Amalric was a complicated figure. He was an educated man, well-versed in theology and scripture. He had risen through the Cistercian order, which had been founded on principles of simplicity, poverty, and spiritual reform. The Cistercians were supposed to be the very opposite of the worldly, corrupt clergy that the Cathars criticized. Yet Arnaud embraced the crusade with an enthusiasm that suggested he saw it not as a regrettable necessity, but as a holy adventure. Or perhaps he genuinely believed that extreme violence was the only language the heretics and their protectors would understand. Medieval sources differ in their portrayal of him. Some present him as a zealot, others as a pragmatic administrator doing an unpleasant job. The truth likely contains elements of both. One of the most famous quotes in history is attributed to Arnaud Amalric, though whether he actually said it remains uncertain. We will encounter this quote soon, at the siege of Béziers. Even if he never spoke those exact words, they have become inseparably linked to his name and to the crusade itself, a symbol of the moral horror that can be unleashed when religious certainty meets military power. As the crusade assembled in Lyon in June 1209, the nobles of the Languedoc watched with growing dread. Count Raymond VI, having been humiliated into reconciliation with the church, tried to join the crusade himself, hoping that by participating he could protect his lands. The crusaders accepted his service but did not trust him. He was placed in an impossible position. If he fought effectively against his own vassals and subjects, he would destroy his own power base. If he held back, he would confirm the suspicions of the crusaders that he was secretly still sympathetic to heresy. Other nobles prepared to resist. The Trinquevel family, Viscounts of Béziers, Carcassonne, and Albi, refused to submit. Young Raymond Roger Trinquevel was only 24 years old, but he was determined to defend his lands and his people. The Trinquevel territories had a particularly high concentration of Cathars, and Raymond Roger, whether from personal belief or political loyalty, was known to protect them. The people of the Languedoc prepared as best they could. Cities reinforced their walls. Castles stockpiled supplies. The perfect ones, counseling nonviolence, could only pray and comfort believers who were terrified of what was coming. Some believers sent their children to relatives in other regions, hoping they would be safe. Others simply tried to go on with their lives, hoping that perhaps the storm would pass them by. But the storm was coming, and it would not pass by. It would fall on the Languedoc with a fury that would shock even hardened warriors. The crusade was not just about suppressing heresy. It became an opportunity for every kind of violence: conquest, plunder, rape, massacre. The spiritual mission became entangled with greed, ambition, cruelty, and the simple human capacity for brutality when given permission to be brutal. Pope Innocent III would later express some regret about the excesses of the crusade, but he never fundamentally questioned its necessity. For him, the end justified the means. If thousands died, if cities burned, if an entire civilization was destroyed, it was worth it to eliminate the cancer of heresy and restore the authority of the Church. This way of thinking, this conviction that one possesses absolute truth, and therefore any action taken in its defense is justified, is not unique to medieval Catholicism. It appears throughout history, in every age and every ideology. It is the moment when faith becomes fanaticism, when righteousness becomes brutality, when the crusader can no longer see the humanity of those they crusade against. The Cathars, who believed that the material world was evil and that violence was always wrong, were about to be crushed by an institution that claimed to represent the Prince of Peace. The irony would be lost on few observers, then or now. In his chambers in Rome, Pope Innocent III knelt in prayer. He prayed for the success of the crusade, for the conversion or destruction of the heretics, for the restoration of true faith to the Languedoc. He believed he was doing God's work. He believed that the terrible things about to happen were necessary for the greater good. Perhaps he was right, by his own theological standards. Perhaps the preservation of Catholic orthodoxy was worth any price. Or perhaps he was unleashing a demon that would haunt the Church for centuries, a precedent for religious violence that would echo through the Inquisition, through the wars of religion, through every moment when Christians killed other Christians in the name of Jesus Christ. History does not give us easy answers about who was right and who was wrong. It only gives us what happened. And what happened next, in the summer of 1209, would be so terrible that it would be remembered for 800 years as one of the darkest chapters in the history of medieval Europe. The army was ready. The commanders were chosen. The Crusaders had taken their vows and received their crosses. In churches across northern France, priests blessed banners and swords, praying that God would give the Crusaders victory over the enemies of the faith. And in the Languedoc, in the cities and castles and villages of the south, people looked northward and saw the dust of approaching armies. They strengthened their gates, said their prayers, and waited for the storm to break. It would not be long now, just days, and then the killing would begin. Chapter 6. The Murder at Saint-Gilles. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a single act of violence that seems almost insignificant at the time, but sets in motion events of terrible magnitude. The murder of Pierre de Castelnau on that January morning in 1208 was such a moment. To understand its impact, we need to understand the man himself and the confrontation that preceded his death. Pierre de Castelnau was a Cistercian monk, chosen by Pope Innocent III as a papal legate to the Languedoc. This meant he was the Pope's personal representative, invested with extraordinary authority to act in the Pope's name. He could excommunicate, place regions under interdict, negotiate with nobles, and demand obedience to the Church's directives. Pierre was, by all accounts, a man of fierce conviction and no political subtlety. Where another diplomat might have used persuasion and compromise, Pierre used threats and ultimatums. He was convinced that the nobles of the Languedoc were betraying their Christian duty by tolerating heresy, and he told them so in the bluntest possible terms. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse was the primary target of Pierre's efforts. Raymond was the most powerful noble in the region, ruling territories that stretched from the Mediterranean to central France. He was also the man best positioned to suppress the Cathar heresy if he chose to do so. But Raymond had no desire to persecute the Cathars, many of whom were his vassals, neighbors, and possibly friends or relatives. The relationship between Pierre de Castelnau and Raymond VI deteriorated over several years. Pierre repeatedly demanded that Raymond take action against heretics. Raymond repeatedly promised to do so but never followed through. Pierre escalated his threats, eventually excommunicating the Count and threatening to encourage Raymond's vassals to rebel against him. In January 1208, the two men met at Saint-Gilles, a town on the Rhône River on the border of Raymond's territories. The meeting went badly. According to the accounts that survive, Raymond was furious at Pierre's continued interference. He made threats, perhaps not seriously meant but intemperate nonetheless. He said things like, "Watch yourself," or "You won't always have the protection you think you have." Different sources record different words, but all agree that the Count was angry and the legate was unmoved. Pierre left the meeting and made camp with his party on the banks of the Rhône, preparing to cross the river the next morning. That night, did someone in Raymond's household take the Count's angry words too literally? Did the Count actually order a killing? Did one of his knights act on his own initiative, thinking he was serving his lord's interests? We will never know for certain. What we know is this. As Pierre prepared to embark on a boat to cross the river at dawn, a knight rode up suddenly. The knight's lance struck Pierre in the back with enough force to pierce his body. The papal legate fell, mortally wounded. Pierre de Castelnau did not die immediately. He lived long enough to understand what had happened, to see his blood pooling on the ground, to feel his life slipping away. According to the chroniclers, his last words were to forgive his murderer and to pray that God would grant peace to the church. Whether this really happened or was a pious invention by later writers, we cannot say. But the image of the martyred legate, forgiving as he died, became powerful propaganda for the crusade that followed. The assassin spurred his horse and vanished before anyone could stop him. He was never conclusively identified. Some accounts name him as a knight in Raymond's service, but these accounts come from Raymond's enemies and may not be reliable. The Count himself vehemently denied ordering the murder, swearing on holy relics that he was innocent. But guilt or innocence mattered less than perception. The murder of a papal legate was an outrage that could not go unanswered. Whether Raymond ordered it or not, it happened in his territory, possibly by one of his men, immediately after a hostile meeting with the victim. The Count was responsible, in the medieval logic of lordship, even if he had not personally wielded the weapon. When news of the murder reached Pope Innocent III in Rome, he reacted with volcanic fury. His letters from this period show a man pushed beyond patience. For years, Innocent had tried to get the nobles of the Languedoc to act against heresy. For years they had defied, delayed, and dissembled. Now one of them, or someone acting for one of them, had murdered the Pope's own representative. Innocent's response was swift and absolute. He excommunicated Raymond VI again, this time with no possibility of easy reconciliation. He released all of Raymond's vassals from their oaths of loyalty, essentially inviting them to rebel. He placed Raymond's territories under interdict, meaning no church services could be performed there, no one could receive the sacraments, no one could be buried in consecrated ground. And most significantly, Innocent called for a crusade. The call went out in March 1208. The Pope addressed it to all the faithful of France, calling on them to take up arms against the heretics of the Languedoc and those who protected them. He offered full remission of sins for all who participated, the same spiritual reward given to crusaders who fought in the Holy Land. He authorized the crusaders to confiscate the lands of condemned heretics and their protectors. This last provision was revolutionary and dangerous. It essentially turned the crusade into a war of conquest, giving legal cover to the seizure of territory from legitimately anointed rulers. It attracted not just pious knights but ambitious ones, men who saw an opportunity to gain estates and power under the banner of religious war. The response to the call was slower than the Pope might have hoped. King Philip II of France was initially reluctant to become involved, his attention focused on his ongoing conflicts with England. But Philip gave his permission for his vassals to go on crusade, which was enough. Dukes, counts, and barons from across northern France began to take the cross. The crusade was set to assemble in Lyon in June 1209, more than a year after Pierre de Castelnau's murder. This delay gave Count Raymond time to attempt reconciliation with the Church. He realized, too late, that he had miscalculated badly. Whether or not he had ordered the murder, he was going to pay for it unless he could appease the Pope. Raymond embarked on a desperate campaign of public penance. He traveled to meet with papal legates, offering to do whatever the Church demanded. He promised to drive out heretics, to suppress heresy, to hand over suspects to church authorities. He offered to go on crusade himself, fighting in the Holy Land as proof of his devotion. The Church accepted his submission but on harsh terms. In June 1209, at Saint-Gilles, in the very place where Pierre de Castelnau had been murdered, Raymond underwent a public ceremony of humiliation. He was forced to strip to the waist and be whipped by a cardinal while processing around the church. He had to swear oaths to obey the Church in all things, to fight heresy, to accept whatever penance was demanded of him. It was a complete surrender, a total humiliation for one of the most powerful nobles in France. But even this was not enough to save him. The crusade had already been called, the armies were already assembling. Northern lords had taken vows, gathered troops, and started marching south. They were not going to turn around just because Raymond had submitted. Moreover, Raymond's submission had come so late, and only under threat, that no one really believed it was sincere. The Pope and the legates suspected he would revert to his old ways as soon as the pressure was off. The Crusaders suspected he was trying to trick them. Even Raymond's own vassals wondered if their lord was a coward, or simply a realist trying to save what he could from an impossible situation. Raymond tried to join the crusade himself, hoping that by participating he could at least have some influence over events and protect some of his territories. The crusade leaders accepted him, but with deep suspicion. He marched with the army but was effectively a hostage, his every move watched, his loyalty constantly questioned. The tragedy of Raymond VI is that he was a man trapped between two worlds. He was a product of the tolerant, sophisticated culture of the Languedoc, where religious diversity was accepted and theological disputes were matters for debate rather than warfare. But he was also a medieval noble who needed the church's approval to maintain legitimacy, who could not openly defy the Pope without losing his authority. He tried to serve two masters and ended up trusted by neither. The church saw him as a heretic sympathizer. The Cathars and their supporters saw him as a betrayer when he submitted to the church. He spent the rest of his life trying to navigate between these impossible positions, sometimes fighting the Crusaders, sometimes cooperating with them, always struggling to preserve some fragment of his power and protect some portion of his people. The murder at Saint-Gilles was the spark that lit a fire across the Languedoc. But like many sparks, it would never have caused such a conflagration if there had not been dry tinder waiting to burn. The tinder was decades of tension between the church and the Cathars, between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the independent nobles of the south, between those who demanded religious uniformity and those who valued tolerance. Pierre de Castelnau's blood soaked into the ground on the banks of the Rhône, and from that stain grew a campaign of violence that would last for decades and kill tens of thousands. Whether he would have wanted such an outcome, we cannot know. Perhaps he would have been satisfied, seeing the crusade as the necessary response to intolerable heresy. Or perhaps, in his final moments, he truly meant his prayer for peace, and would have been horrified at the carnage wrought in his name. The morning after the murder, the Rhône flowed on, indifferent to human drama. Birds sang in the trees along the riverbank. The sun rose over the distant hills. Life continued, as it always does, even after moments that changed the course of history. But for the people of the Languedoc, everything had changed. The storm was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. The armies were coming, and very soon, the killing would begin. Chapter 7. The Crusade descends like thunder. The summer of 1209 was warm and dry across southern France. In the fields around the cities of the Languedoc, the wheat was ripening, ready for harvest. In the vineyards on the hillsides, grapes were swelling with juice, promising a good vintage. It should have been a time of plenty, of harvest celebrations, of gratitude for the land's bounty. Instead, it was a time of fear. Because marching down from the north, following the Rhône Valley southward, came an army unlike anything the Languedoc had seen in generations. The Crusader army that assembled at Lyon in June 1209 numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men, though medieval numbers are always uncertain. It included some of the greatest nobles of northern France, the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Nevers, the Count of Saint-Pol, and many others. These were not minor knights seeking fortune, but established lords with armies of their own, men who commanded respect and inspired fear. They came for various reasons. Some genuinely believed they were serving God by crushing heresy. Others saw an opportunity for glory, for land, for adventure. Many were likely motivated by a mixture of piety and pragmatism, as most humans are when presented with an opportunity that serves both their conscience and their ambition. They had taken vows to serve for 40 days, the minimum required to earn their spiritual rewards. After 40 days, they would be free to go home, their sins forgiven, their duty to God fulfilled. The army was nominally led by a council of great lords, but the spiritual authority rested with the papal legates, particularly Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux. Arnaud was tasked with ensuring that the crusade remained focused on its religious mission, that it was a holy war, and not merely a conquest for territory. How well he succeeded in this mission would become a matter of bitter debate. The Crusaders moved slowly south, following the Rhône. Their banners displayed crosses, the symbol of their holy purpose. Priests accompanied the army, holding masses each day, blessing the soldiers, reminding them that they fought for Christ. The army sang hymns as it marched, psalms praising God and calling down judgment on his enemies. For the people of the Languedoc watching this army approach, it must have seemed like a force of nature, inevitable and unstoppable. The cities on the Crusades' route faced a terrible choice: submit immediately and hope for mercy, or resist and risk total destruction. The first major target was the city of Béziers, one of the seats of the Trinquevel family. Young Raymond Roger Trinquevel, Viscount of Béziers, Carcassonne, and Albi, was the Crusaders' primary target in the region. He had refused to submit to the Church's demands, refused to persecute the Cathars in his lands, refused to hand over suspected heretics. This made him, in the Crusaders' eyes, as guilty as the heretics themselves. Raymond Roger was only 24 years old, but he faced his situation with remarkable courage. He traveled to Béziers to organize its defense, then moved on to his capital at Carcassonne, the stronger fortress that would be his final refuge. He urged the people of Béziers to evacuate to safer locations or to submit to the Crusaders. But many chose to stay, either from loyalty to their lord, from faith in their walls, or simply from the stubborn hope that somehow the storm might pass them by. The papal legates sent messages to Béziers before the army arrived. The city was given a choice: surrender all known Cathars and heretics to the Crusaders, submit to the Church's authority, accept a garrison of northern troops, or face siege. The Catholics of Béziers could save themselves by identifying and expelling the Cathars among them. The city's response was remarkable. The Catholic bishop and clergy of Béziers, along with the city's leading citizens, refused the Crusaders' terms. They would not betray their neighbors, would not hand over fellow townspeople to be burned. Whatever religious differences existed within the city walls, they were united in their loyalty to each other and their determination not to submit to invasion. This solidarity was rooted in the culture of the Languedoc. In this region, the bonds of community and shared citizenship often proved stronger than religious division. Catholics and Cathars had lived side by side for generations. They were neighbors, business partners, friends, relatives. The idea of suddenly betraying these relationships because an army from the north demanded it was unthinkable to many. The crusade arrived at the walls of Béziers on July 21, 1209. It was a Thursday, the feast day of Mary Magdalene, a day that should have been devoted to peace and prayer. Instead, it became a day of horror that would echo through history. The Crusaders set up their siege camp and prepared for what they expected would be a lengthy siege. Béziers was well fortified, well supplied, and defended by several thousand armed men. A siege might last weeks or months. The Crusaders might not even attempt a direct assault, instead settling in to starve the city into submission. But fate, or chance, or perhaps just human folly, intervened. On the morning of July 22nd, some of Béziers' defenders made a sortie from the gates, attacking part of the Crusader camp. This was not an unusual tactic. Defenders often made quick attacks to harass besiegers and test their strength. But this sortie went badly. The Crusaders counterattacked in force, driving the defenders back to the city gates. And then something unexpected happened. The Crusaders' camp followers, servants, laborers, fortune seekers who accompanied every medieval army, surged forward in a disorganized mob. These were not disciplined knights, but poor men hoping for plunder. They saw the gates open and rushed toward them before they could close. The defenders were unable to close the gates in time. The mob of camp followers poured into the city, and behind them came the soldiers, and behind them the knights. Within minutes, the Crusaders were inside Béziers. The siege that should have lasted weeks was over in less than a day. What happened next was a massacre of such scale and brutality that it shocked even medieval sensibilities, accustomed as they were to violence. The Crusaders fell upon the city like wolves on a flock. They killed everyone they found: men, women, children, elderly, infants. Catholic and Cathar alike died, because in the chaos and bloodlust, there was no time or interest in distinguishing between them. People fled to the churches, believing they would find sanctuary there. Medieval law held that churches were sacred spaces where violence was forbidden. But the Crusaders ignored these rules. They broke into churches and slaughtered everyone inside. In the great church of Mary Magdalene, thousands had taken refuge. The Crusaders killed them all and then set the church ablaze. The exact death toll will never be known. Medieval chroniclers give wildly varying numbers, from 7,000 to 20,000 or more. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people died that day. In a city whose total population was perhaps 15 to 20,000, this means that nearly everyone was killed. Béziers was effectively depopulated, erased, transformed from a thriving city into a charnel house. It is in the context of this massacre that we encounter the infamous quote attributed to Arnaud Amalric. According to a chronicler writing a few decades later, when the Crusaders asked Arnaud how they should distinguish between Catholics and heretics during the attack, he replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether Arnaud actually said these words is uncertain. No contemporary source records them. The chronicler who wrote them down, Caesarius of Heisterbach, was writing 20 years after the events, and he may have been repeating rumors or inventing dramatic dialogue, as medieval writers often did. Arnaud's own report to the Pope mentions the massacre but says nothing so callous. Yet the quote has persisted through history because, even if Arnaud never spoke those exact words, they capture something essential about what happened at Béziers. The Crusaders made no effort to distinguish the innocent from the guilty, the Catholic from the Cathar. They simply killed everyone. Whether this was Arnaud's explicit command or simply the inevitable result of urban warfare in the medieval period, the outcome was the same. A city destroyed, its people slaughtered, the distinction between heretic and orthodox rendered meaningless by blood and fire. After the killing came the looting. The Crusaders stripped the city of everything valuable: gold, silver, fine cloth, jewels, anything portable that could be carried away. Then they burned what remained. The fires spread from building to building until the entire city was ablaze. The heat was so intense that the bells in the church towers melted and fell crashing down. For days afterward, the smoke from Béziers could be seen for miles across the Languedoc. It rose like a black pillar into the summer sky, visible from distant hills and towns. It was a message, clear and terrible. This is what happens to cities that defy the crusade. This is what happens when you protect heretics. Submit, or this will be your fate. The psychological impact of Béziers' destruction cannot be overstated. It shattered the sense of security that the people of the Languedoc had felt behind their city walls. It demonstrated that the Crusaders would not follow the usual rules of medieval warfare, where cities were ransomed rather than destroyed, where civilians were generally spared even when soldiers were killed, where churches truly were sanctuaries. News of the massacre spread rapidly through the region. In castles and towns across the Languedoc, people looked at their walls with new eyes and wondered if they were really protection or just larger tombs. The nobles who had planned to resist began to reconsider. The people who had trusted in their fortifications began to doubt. Count Raymond Roger Toncavel, hearing the news in Carcassonne, must have felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. His city, his people, destroyed in a single day. And he knew that Carcassonne would be next, that the Crusaders would soon turn their attention to his capital, and that he faced an enemy that was both stronger than he had anticipated and more brutal than he had imagined. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were energized by their victory. True, it had been chaotic and bloody rather than a demonstration of military skill. True, they had violated every principle of Christian mercy and violated the sanctity of churches. But they had won, quickly and decisively. They had proven their power. And perhaps in their minds, they had delivered God's judgment on a city full of heretics. Arnaud Amalric wrote to Pope Innocent III describing the fall of Béziers. His letter is brief and matter-of-fact. He reports that the city was taken and that nearly 20,000 were put to the sword. He mentions that neither age nor sex nor status was spared. He says that after the killing the city was plundered and burned. He describes all this without apparent emotion, as if reporting the weather. The Pope's response when it came praised the success of the crusade. There is no record of Innocent expressing horror at the massacre, no condemnation of the violation of church sanctuary, no concern for the thousands of Catholics killed alongside the heretics. The crusade was achieving its purpose. That was what mattered. In the ruins of Béziers, in the days after the Crusaders moved on, scavengers came to pick through the ashes. They found corpses everywhere, in houses, in streets, piled in the churches, burned beyond recognition. The bodies were so numerous that there was no possibility of individual burial. They were collected and dumped in mass graves, or simply left to rot where they fell. Dogs and crows fed on the dead. The stench of death hung over the city for weeks. The Orbe River, which flowed past the city, was fouled with bodies and refuse. The city that had been alive with commerce and conversation just days before was now silent except for the wind moving through burned timbers and the cries of scavenging birds. A few survivors emerged from hiding places in cellars or from having fled before the attack. They walked through streets they no longer recognized, looking for families they would never find. They stood amid the ruins of their homes, their churches, their city, and tried to comprehend what had happened. They were the witnesses who would carry the story of Béziers forward, who would tell their children and grandchildren about the day the Crusaders came and destroyed everything. The massacre of Béziers was not the worst atrocity of the Albigensian Crusade. In terms of numbers killed, other events would exceed it. But it was the first major atrocity, the one that set the tone for everything that followed. It demonstrated that this crusade would be different from the wars of the Holy Land, more intimate and more brutal. A war where the enemy looked and spoke and prayed much like the Crusaders themselves, and where that similarity made no difference at all. The Crusaders packed up their camp and moved on toward their next target. Behind them, Béziers burned. Ahead of them lay Carcassonne, where young Raymond Roger Troncavel waited with his army, determined to resist even though he now knew what resistance would cost. The summer of 1209 was not yet half over. The harvest would not be gathered that year in many places, for there was no one left to gather it. The grapes would rot on the vines. The wheat would stand in the fields, turning brown and falling over, while the land waited for people who would never return. The crusade had begun, and the Languedoc would never be the same. Chapter 8. The Siege of Béziers and its Horror. Let us pause for a moment and step back from the military narrative to understand what the fall of Béziers meant for the individuals who lived through it, and for the broader understanding of the Cathar persecution. Because behind the numbers, behind the military accounts, were human beings with hopes and fears, with families and futures, all of which were extinguished in a single day. Imagine a woman named Père, a weaver living in Béziers with her husband and 3 children. She is Catholic, attending Mass at the cathedral, raising her children in the faith. But her neighbor is a Cathar believer, a kind woman who sometimes watches Père's children when she goes to market. They have been friends for years. Their children play together in the street. When the Crusaders send their ultimatum demanding that all Cathars be expelled from the city, Père faces a choice. She could identify her neighbor, could point her out to the authorities. This would prove her own Catholic orthodoxy, might save her life when the Crusaders come. But how could she do this? How could she betray a friend, condemn her to burning, destroy her family? The woman has never hurt anyone, has always been gentle and kind. Whatever theological errors she holds, does she deserve death? Père chooses loyalty over safety. She says nothing. And when the Crusaders break through the gates, she dies with her neighbor, with her husband, with her children. The Crusaders make no distinction. They are all just bodies in the way of swords and fire. Multiply Père by thousands. Give each person a name, a story, a life full of small moments and ordinary hopes. Then erase them all in a few hours of chaos and violence. That is what happened at Béziers. The sources we have from participants in the crusade show how thoroughly some of them had dehumanized their victims. One chronicler, writing approvingly of the massacre, describes the crusaders as harvesting the Lord's vineyard, cutting down the diseased vines so healthy ones could grow. The metaphor is agricultural, cleansing, almost gentle. It erases the reality of children being cut down by swords, of babies being thrown from walls, of old people being burned alive in churches. This ability to describe mass killing in sanitized language, to frame it as necessary purification rather than murder, is not unique to the medieval period. Every age and culture that commits atrocities develops its own euphemisms, its own ways of making the unbearable seem reasonable. The Crusaders called it purification. They called it God's judgment. They called it necessary for the salvation of souls. But it was still children dying. It was still a city full of people who had been alive in the morning and were corpses by evening. The perfect ones in Béziers, those gentle ascetics who preached nonviolence and spiritual liberation, died alongside everyone else. Their theology taught them that the body was just a prison, that death would free their souls to return to the realm of light. Perhaps this belief gave them courage as the Crusaders' swords descended. Perhaps they died praying, certain that they were finally escaping the evil material world. Or perhaps in their final moments, they felt the same terror and pain that any human feels when facing violent death. Perhaps their philosophical detachment failed them when the reality of steel cutting flesh became immediate. We will never know. The perfect ones left no final testimonies from Béziers. They simply disappeared into the mass graves with everyone else. The fall of Béziers had strategic as well as human consequences. It demonstrated to other cities in the region that resistance was hopeless. Within days of Béziers' destruction, several towns and castles surrendered to the Crusaders without a fight. Their lords calculated quite reasonably that submission was better than annihilation. But some still chose to resist. Young Raymond Roger Troncavel in Carcassonne decided he would not surrender his capital without a fight. Perhaps he believed that Carcassonne's stronger fortifications would allow it to succeed where Béziers had failed. Perhaps he felt honor-bound to defend his inheritance. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to submit to the men who had just massacred his subjects. The Crusaders arrived at Carcassonne in early August 1209, less than 2 weeks after destroying Béziers. But Carcassonne was a very different challenge. It was larger, more strongly fortified, better supplied, and more determinedly defended. The city had double walls, a powerful citadel, and a garrison of experienced soldiers. Raymond Roger had gathered troops from across his territories to defend his capital. The Crusaders settled in for a proper siege. They surrounded the city, cut off its water supply, and prepared to starve it into submission. In the summer heat, conditions inside the city rapidly deteriorated. The wells within the walls could not supply enough water for the thousands of people crammed inside. Disease began to spread. The stench of human waste filled the air. Raymond Roger made several attempts to negotiate. He offered to surrender himself if the Crusaders would spare the city and its people. The Crusader leaders refused. They wanted not just Raymond Roger but total submission. The city must surrender unconditionally, place itself entirely at the Crusaders' mercy. After 2 weeks of siege, with conditions inside becoming unbearable, Raymond Roger agreed to come to the Crusader camp under safe conduct to negotiate. It was a trap. The Crusaders seized him, claiming he had forfeited his rights by protecting heretics. They threw him in his own prison, in the dungeons of Carcassonne, and refused to release him. With their lord captured and held hostage, with water running out and disease spreading, the defenders of Carcassonne had no choice. They negotiated a surrender. The terms were harsh, but not as catastrophic as Béziers. The people would be allowed to leave the city alive, but they could take nothing with them. No possessions, no money, no food, just the clothes on their backs. The Crusaders would take the city and everything in it. On August 15, 1209, the Feast of the Assumption, the gates of Carcassonne opened and thousands of people streamed out. They walked out into exile with nothing, leaving behind their homes, their possessions, their entire lives. They were alive, which was more than the people of Béziers could say. But they were ruined, reduced to refugees in their own land. Among them were Cathars and Catholics, nobles and commoners, all equal now in their poverty and displacement. They scattered across the Languedoc, seeking shelter with relatives or friends, trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered. Many died in the weeks and months that followed, from disease, from hunger, from the sheer difficulty of surviving with nothing in a region devastated by war. Raymond Roger Trencavel remained in prison. He was 24 years old, dispossessed of his titles and lands, held captive in his own castle. 3 months later, in November 1209, he died. The official cause was listed as dysentery, which was common enough in medieval prisons. But many suspected he was murdered, either through deliberate poisoning or through deliberate neglect. He had become an inconvenient reminder that the Crusaders had violated safe conduct, and dead men caused no embarrassment. With Raymond Roger gone and Carcassonne captured, the Crusaders needed someone to govern the conquered territories. They chose Simon de Montfort, a northern French knight of great military skill and fierce religious conviction. Simon had distinguished himself during the siege, and more importantly, he was willing to stay in the Languedoc after the 40-day Crusader vows expired and most of the army went home. Simon de Montfort would become the dominant military figure of the Crusade for the next decade. He was a complicated man, deeply pious, attending Mass daily and living austerely, yet capable of extraordinary brutality. He genuinely believed he was doing God's work. He saw the Cathars as spiritual enemies who threatened the salvation of souls, and he was willing to use any means necessary to destroy them. Under Simon's leadership, the crusade became more organized but no less brutal. He methodically conquered castles and towns throughout the region. When a fortress surrendered quickly, he was sometimes merciful, allowing the defenders to leave with their lives. But when a place resisted, he made examples of them. At the castle of Bram, after a siege in 1210, Simon ordered that 100 defenders have their eyes gouged out and their noses cut off. He left one man with a single eye intact to lead the others to the next castle, as a warning of what resistance would bring. It was a message written in mutilation: submit or suffer. At Minerve, after a siege in the summer of 1210, the Crusaders offered terms. Catholics could leave freely, but Cathars must renounce their faith or die. About 140 perfect ones were in the town. They were given the chance to convert and live. Not one accepted. They were all burned together in a large pyre, singing hymns as the flames rose. The site where they died was called the Field of the Burned, and the name endures to this day. This pattern repeated across the Languedoc through 1210 and 1211. Castles fell one by one. Some surrendered, some resisted. The perfect ones, when captured, almost always refused to renounce their faith. They went to the fires with remarkable courage, seeing death as liberation from the material world they had spent their lives trying to escape. The believers, the ordinary Cathar faithful, faced harder choices. They could recant, swear loyalty to the Catholic Church, accept penance, and live. Many did, particularly those with families to protect. But the Inquisition would remember their names, and years later, long after the crusade ended, they would be called to account again. By 1211, much of the Languedoc was under Simon de Montfort's control. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse had tried to navigate between cooperation and resistance, satisfying no one. His lands were gradually being taken from him by the crusade he had once been forced to join. The native nobility of the region, seeing their world being destroyed, began to organize resistance. But they were fighting not just an army, but an institution. Behind the Crusaders came the Church, establishing inquisitions, rooting out heresy, ensuring that even after the soldiers left, the persecution would continue. The Cathars were being systematically destroyed, not just killed but erased from history, their books burned, their beliefs condemned, their very existence denied by the victors who wrote the chronicles. In the quiet places of the Languedoc, in caves and forests and hidden valleys, some Cathars went into hiding. The perfect ones continued their ministry in secret, moving by night, meeting believers in barns and cellars, performing the consolamentum in whispers. The faith that had flourished openly was now driven underground, but it had not yet been extinguished. The crusade that was supposed to last 40 days had stretched into years, and would continue for decades. The war that was supposed to be about suppressing heresy had become a war of conquest, remaking the political map of southern France. The violence that was supposed to serve God's purpose had become an engine of destruction that consumed guilty and innocent alike. And through it all, the Cathars maintained their faith. They believed that this world was evil, created by a false god, a realm of suffering and injustice. Everything that happened to them, the massacres, the burnings, the torture, the persecution, only confirmed what they had always taught. This material world was indeed a prison, controlled by evil. Their theology was being validated by their suffering. But validation through suffering is a bitter thing, and the suffering was far from over. Chapter 9. Castles in the Clouds. In the years following the fall of Carcassonne, the nature of the conflict shifted. What had begun as a crusade of religious purification became a grinding war of conquest and resistance. The great armies of northern knights came and went, fulfilling their 40-day vows and returning home. But Simon de Montfort remained, determined to solidify control over the territories he had conquered and to continue the campaign against heresy and those who sheltered it. The geography of the Languedoc became crucial to the conflict's evolution. This was not flat country suitable for set-piece battles between armies. This was a land of mountains and valleys, of fortified hilltops and remote plateaus. The Pyrenees rose along the southern border, creating a landscape of dramatic beauty and military difficulty. Castles clung to mountain peaks, accessible only by narrow, winding paths that made them nearly impossible to assault. These mountain fortresses became the last refuges of the Cathar faith and the native nobility who resisted the northern conquest. While the major cities fell to the Crusaders, the high castles held out, some for years, some for decades. They were supplied by loyal villagers in the valleys below, defended by determined garrisons, and inhabited by perfect ones, who continued to minister to believers who made the difficult pilgrimage up mountain paths to receive the consolamentum. The most famous of these fortresses was Montségur, though its importance would not become fully apparent until later in the crusade. But there were dozens of others: Quéribus, Pérepertus, Termes, Puivert, Roquefixade. Each had its own story, its own siege, its own tragedy. Together they represented the stubborn refusal of the Languedoc to submit completely to the invaders from the north. Simon de Montfort proved to be a brilliant but ruthless military commander. He understood siege warfare, understood how to cut off supplies, how to build siege engines, how to maintain pressure until a fortress surrendered. But he also understood terror. He used exemplary violence, mass executions, mutilations, burnings, to convince other garrisons that resistance was futile. Yet despite his successes, Simon faced constant problems. He never had enough troops. Most crusaders fulfilled their 40-day vows and left. He had to constantly request reinforcements from the north, enticing new recruits with promises of land and spiritual rewards. He also faced rebellion from territories he thought he had pacified. A castle would surrender, he would leave a garrison and move on, and then the local population would rise up and reclaim it. The native nobility, dispossessed of their lands and titles, waged a guerrilla war against the Crusaders. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, though excommunicated and technically stripped of his lands, retained the loyalty of many of his subjects. His son, Raymond VII, was growing into a capable military leader who would carry on the resistance. The war became a cycle of conquest and rebellion, siege and counter-siege, with horrific violence punctuating long periods of stalemate. Both sides committed atrocities. The Crusaders burned heretics and massacred populations that resisted. The defenders, when they could, ambushed Crusader patrols and assassinated northern officials. The usual rules of knightly warfare, which provided some protection to nobles and civilians, broke down in a conflict where religious and ethnic hatred reinforced military conflict. For the Cathars themselves, these years were a time of increasing persecution, but also of remarkable resilience. The public preaching of the early years became impossible. The perfect ones could no longer travel openly from village to village. But they adapted to the new circumstances, developing an underground network that allowed them to continue their ministry in secret. Believers would pass messages about when and where a perfect one would be available. A family might host 2 perfects for a night, hiding them in a cellar or attic during the day and allowing them to preach to a small group after dark. The consolamentum was administered in secret ceremonies, often hurriedly, always with the risk of discovery and execution hanging over everyone present. This underground period produced some of our best sources about Cathar belief and practice, because it left records in the form of Inquisition testimonies. After the military conquest was largely complete, the Church established formal inquisitions to root out remaining heresy. These tribunals kept meticulous records of their interrogations. While we must read these sources critically, they were created by enemies of the Cathars, designed to extract confessions and identify accomplices. They provide invaluable details about how ordinary people practiced Catharism. We learn, for example, about the networks of safe houses where perfect ones could hide. We learn about the signals believers used to identify each other. We learn about the women, often from noble families, who supported the underground church with their resources and protection. We learn about the immense loyalty that many believers showed, enduring torture and imprisonment, rather than betray the perfects they sheltered. One such woman was Esclarmonde de Foix, a member of one of the most powerful noble families in the region. Esclarmonde had become a parfaite, one of the female perfects, and she used her status and connections to protect other Cathars. She established safe houses, organized networks, debated Catholic theologians, and became one of the most visible leaders of the Cathar Church. Her brother, Raymond Roger, Count of Foix, was a fierce opponent of the Crusaders. His castle at Foix was one of the strongest in the Pyrenees, and he used it as a base for military operations against Simon de Montfort. The Foix family represented the alliance between the Cathar faith and the native nobility's resistance to northern conquest. In 1213, the political situation shifted dramatically. King Peter II of Aragon, who ruled territories on both sides of the Pyrenees, decided to intervene in the conflict. Peter was Catholic, but he was also overlord to several of the nobles fighting against the Crusade, and he saw Simon de Montfort's conquests as a threat to his own power. He raised an army and marched north to challenge the Crusaders. The 2 armies met at the Battle of Muret on September 12, 1213. Peter commanded a force that outnumbered Simon's army by perhaps 3-1. The battle should have been a decisive victory for the Aragonese and their allies, finally breaking the Crusaders' power in the region. Instead, it became a disaster. Simon de Montfort, demonstrating the military genius that made him so formidable, launched a surprise cavalry charge that smashed into the Aragonese lines. The charge broke through to King Peter himself, and in the chaos of close combat, the king was struck down and killed. With their leader dead, the Aragonese army broke and fled. Thousands were killed in the pursuit. The Battle of Muret ensured that the crusade would continue. The native resistance had lost its most powerful ally and its best chance at a decisive military victory. Simon de Montfort's prestige soared. The Pope praised him as a champion of the faith. The northern French nobility saw him as a successful conqueror. He now controlled most of the Languedoc, at least nominally. But controlling territory and eliminating heresy proved to be very different things. The Cathars, driven from the cities and towns, found refuge in the mountain castles. The perfect ones continued their ministry, now with an urgency born of persecution. They knew that time was running out, that the fortresses would eventually fall, that the church would never stop hunting them. Many believers, seeing the persecution intensify, chose to receive the consolamentum during these years. If they were going to be killed anyway, better to die as one of the perfect, assured of spiritual liberation, than to die as an ordinary believer and risk having to be reborn into this world of suffering again. The number of perfects actually increased during the persecution, as people chose martyrdom over submission. The consolamentum ceremonies in this period took on a special poignancy. Everyone present knew they might be discovered at any moment. The perfect administering the sacrament knew he or she was likely going to the fire eventually. The believer receiving it was embracing a path that would probably end in execution. Yet they proceeded, hands laid on heads, prayers whispered in flickering candlelight, faith affirmed in defiance of overwhelming power. In 1215, Pope Innocent III called the Fourth Lateran Council, a great gathering of bishops and church leaders in Rome. Among its many decisions, the council formally condemned the Cathar heresy and established more rigorous procedures for identifying and punishing heretics. The Inquisition was given greater powers. Secular rulers were ordered, under pain of excommunication, to assist in the persecution of heresy. The council also addressed the political situation in the Languedoc. It confirmed Simon de Montfort's conquests, officially granting him the titles and lands that he had taken by force. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse was definitively stripped of his territories and condemned as a protector of heresy. The Church had made its judgment. The crusade was legitimate. The conquest was permanent. The native nobility had forfeited their rights by tolerating heresy. But neither papal decrees nor battlefield victories could change the fundamental geography and sociology of the region. The mountains still stood. The castles still clung to their peaks. The people of the Languedoc still remembered what had been taken from them. And in those castles, in those mountains, the Cathars still lived and practiced their faith. Simon de Montfort continued his campaigns through 1216 and 1217. He besieged castles, extracted submissions, executed heretics. But he was fighting an unwinnable war. Every castle he took required a garrison he didn't have. Every execution created more martyrs and more resentment. Every northern lord he installed to govern conquered territory was an occupier resented by the local population. In 1218, Simon laid siege to Toulouse itself. Count Raymond VI and his son Raymond VII had returned to their capital, and the city had welcomed them back and declared rebellion against Simon's rule. The siege lasted 9 months, and during it, Simon de Montfort met his end. On June 25, 1218, a stone fired from a siege engine on the city walls struck him in the head, killing him instantly. The leader of the crusade was dead, killed by a rock thrown by defenders who, according to some accounts, included women helping to operate the siege weapons. The man who had conquered most of the Languedoc, who had executed thousands, who had seemed unstoppable, was gone in a moment, his skull shattered by stone. The Crusaders buried Simon with honor, praising him as a martyr for the faith. The people of the Languedoc celebrated his death as divine justice. To the Cathars, his death confirmed what they had always believed. The material world was chaos, violence begat violence, and the Rex Mundi rewarded his servants with death and suffering just as he inflicted it on everyone else. Simon's son Amalric tried to continue his father's work, but he lacked Simon's military skill and ruthless determination. Over the next few years, the territories Simon had conquered began to slip away. Castles were retaken, cities declared for the Raymond family. The crusade lost momentum. But the persecution of the Cathars did not stop. If anything, it intensified, because the Church realized that military conquest was not enough. Heresy had to be rooted out methodically, believer by believer, through interrogation and investigation. The age of the Crusade was giving way to the age of the Inquisition, and in the mountains, in the castles in the clouds, the Cathars waited and prayed, knowing that the end was coming, that eventually the fortresses would fall and the fires would burn. But for now, for a few more years, they were free. Free to practice their faith, free to live according to their beliefs, free to prepare their souls for the liberation that death would bring. Chapter 10. The Inquisition's Patient Eye. The transition from Crusade to Inquisition marked a fundamental shift in how the Catholic Church approached the problem of the Cathars. Military force had conquered territory and killed thousands, but it had not eliminated the heresy. Perfect ones still moved in secret through the Languedoc. Believers still gathered for illegal preaching. The faith had been driven underground, but underground it persisted. The Inquisition was the Church's answer to this problem. It was not, initially, the dramatic tribunal of popular imagination, with hooded figures and torture chambers. It began as a more systematic approach to identifying heretics through careful investigation and interrogation. But over time, it would develop into one of the most feared institutions of medieval Europe. The word Inquisition simply means inquiry. Papal inquisitors were investigators with special powers to question suspected heretics, gather evidence, and pass judgment. Unlike regular bishops who had many other responsibilities, inquisitors could focus entirely on rooting out heresy. They could travel anywhere in their assigned territories, compel testimony, seize property, and hand convicted heretics over to secular authorities for punishment. The first formal inquisitors were appointed to the Languedoc in the 1220s and 1230s. They were often Dominican friars, members of the order founded by Dominic de Guzman, the same man who had tried to preach against the Cathars before the Crusade. The Dominicans were well educated, trained in theology and law, skilled in debate. They were also, in theory, bound to poverty and simplicity, which meant they could not be accused of the worldly corruption that had made the Cathars so critical of the regular clergy. The inquisitors came to towns and villages and announced their presence. They would preach sermons explaining the errors of heresy and calling on anyone with information about heretics to come forward. They offered a period of grace, usually 30 days, during which people could confess their own heretical beliefs or activities and receive relatively light penances, fasts, pilgrimages, wearing special crosses on their clothing. This period of grace was a shrewd psychological tool. It encouraged people to confess before they were accused, which made them cooperative witnesses rather than defiant heretics. It created a climate of suspicion where no one knew who might be confessing, who might be providing names, who might be the next person called before the tribunal. After the period of grace ended, the serious work began. The inquisitors would summon individuals for questioning. These interrogations were conducted in private, without legal representation for the accused. The inquisitors asked detailed questions. Had the person ever attended a Cathar preaching? Had they ever sheltered a perfect? Had they received the consolamentum? Had they seen anyone else do these things? Who were they? When? Where? The inquisitors kept meticulous records. Every testimony was written down by scribes, dated, signed, or marked by the witness. Over decades, the Inquisition accumulated vast archives of information about who the Cathars were, how they organized, what they believed, who protected them. These records are invaluable to modern historians, but they were gathered for a terrible purpose: the systematic destruction of a faith. If someone was accused and denied the charges, the Inquisition had tools to extract confession. Torture was authorized, though with restrictions. It was supposed to be used only when there was strong evidence of guilt and the person refused to confess. It was supposed to leave no permanent marks or cause no permanent injury. It could only be applied once. In practice, these restrictions were often circumvented. Torture could be continued on another day, technically not violating the rule about using it only once. The methods included the strappado, hanging by the arms twisted behind the back, the rack, stretching the body, and water torture, forcing water down the throat to simulate drowning. These methods could extract confessions from almost anyone, whether guilty or innocent. Those convicted of heresy faced various punishments depending on the severity of their crimes and their willingness to repent. First-time offenders who confessed and repented might receive penances, wearing yellow crosses on their clothing to publicly mark them as former heretics, making pilgrimages to holy sites, paying fines, losing property. More serious offenders, or those who had relapsed into heresy after previously confessing, were immured, imprisoned for life, often in tiny cells where they could barely move. The prisons of the Inquisition were harsh, and many immured prisoners died within a few years from the conditions. The most serious punishment was relaxation to the secular arm. This was the Church's euphemism for execution. The Church technically did not execute heretics. It handed them over to secular authorities with a recommendation of mercy, knowing full well that the law required secular authorities to burn convicted heretics. This allowed the Church to maintain the fiction that it did not shed blood. One of the most famous inquisitors was Bernard Gui, who served in the Languedoc in the early 14th century, decades after the main crusade had ended. Bernard wrote a manual for inquisitors, explaining how to conduct interrogations, how to identify different types of heretics, how to extract confessions. His manual reveals the sophisticated techniques the Inquisition had developed, asking the same questions multiple times in different ways to catch inconsistencies. bringing witnesses to confront the accused, using information from one testimony to trap another witness. Bernard Guy's records show that the Inquisition was still finding and prosecuting Cathars well into the 1320s, more than a century after the Crusade began. The faith had proven remarkably resilient, passing from generation to generation, maintained by networks of believers who preserved the traditions even as the perfect ones became fewer and fewer. But the Inquisition was patient. It could wait. It could investigate for years, building cases slowly, identifying entire networks. And when it struck thoroughly. Whole families could be destroyed, entire villages decimated by arrests and executions. The records of the Inquisition provide us with extraordinary details about ordinary people's lives. We learn about a shepherd named Pierre Maury, who traveled between France and Spain, carrying messages between scattered Cathar communities. We learn about Béatrice de Planissolles, a minor noblewoman who had affairs with priests and flirtations with Cathar beliefs, whose complicated personal life was laid bare in testimony that reads like a novel. These testimonies remind us that the Cathars were not theological abstractions, but real people with complex, messy human lives. They believed in spiritual purity, but they also gossiped about neighbors, worried about money, fell in love unwisely, made mistakes, tried to do better. The Inquisition's records, intended to condemn them, instead preserved their humanity for us to rediscover centuries later. The presence of the Inquisition also affected the broader culture of the Languedoc. The region that had been known for its tolerance, its troubadours, its sophisticated courts became fearful and repressed. The culture of questioning and debate that had allowed Catharism to flourish in the first place was suppressed. Intellectual life contracted. Art and literature became more conservative, more aligned with Orthodox Catholic themes. The troubadours, those poets who had celebrated courtly love and refined emotion, found their art constrained. Some troubadours had been sympathetic to the Cathars, or had patrons who protected heretics. After the Crusade and the Inquisition, they had to be careful. The joyful celebration of earthly love that had characterized troubadour poetry began to give way to more spiritual themes, more explicitly Christian imagery. The entire civilization of the Languedoc was being reshaped by the Inquisition's presence. It was no longer safe to be different, to question, to explore alternative ideas. Conformity became survival. Silence became wisdom. The vibrant, contentious, creative culture of the pre-Crusade Languedoc was replaced by something more fearful and constrained. Yet, despite the Inquisition's power, despite its patience and its thoroughness, it could not reach everywhere. In the high castles of the Pyrenees, communities of Cathars still lived relatively openly. The mountain fortresses were too remote, too difficult to besiege, too expensive to conquer for the sake of the few dozen or few hundred heretics they sheltered. The most important of these refuges was Montségur, a fortress perched on a mountain peak in the Ariège region of the Pyrenees. Montségur became the de facto capital of the Cathar Church in exile, the place where the remaining bishops and perfect ones gathered, where believers came on pilgrimage to receive the consolamentum, where the faith was kept alive in defiance of all the power arrayed against it. Montségur had been rebuilt and strengthened in the 1230s and 1240s, specifically to serve as a refuge. Its lord, Raymond de Perret, was a protector of the Cathars. His wife and daughters were believers. The castle housed not just soldiers but a substantial community of perfect ones, perhaps 150 or more at its peak, along with their supporters and protectors. For the Inquisition and the Church, Montségur became an obsession. It was a symbol of the Cathars' continued existence, a visible reminder that the heresy had not been completely suppressed. As long as Montségur stood, the Church's victory was incomplete. The fortress seemed impregnable. It stood on a rocky outcrop, with sheer cliffs on several sides. The only approach was a narrow, winding path, easily defended by a small force. The garrison was experienced and determined. The castle was well supplied, with cisterns for water and storerooms for food. But the Church was patient, and eventually the resources would be gathered, the army assembled, the siege engines built. Eventually Montségur would face its final test, and when it fell, as fortresses always eventually do, the heart would be torn out of the Cathar faith. But that moment was still ahead. For now, in the 1230s, Montségur stood defiant, a castle in the clouds, a beacon of hope for believers across the Languedoc. The Inquisition could arrest and interrogate in the towns below, but it could not reach the mountain peak where the perfect ones still prayed and preached and prepared souls for liberation. The contest between the fortress and the institution, between the mountain and the Inquisition, was approaching its climax. One of them would win, and one would be destroyed. The outcome seemed inevitable, but the Cathars had never believed that outcomes in the material world were what truly mattered. What mattered was the state of the soul, and in that contest, they believed they had already won. Chapter 11. The Fortress of Montségur. Montségur. Even the name sounds like a place of legend, of last stands and tragic heroism. Translated, it means secure mountain, and for more than 40 years it lived up to that name. Perched on a rocky outcrop nearly 4,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by steep slopes and cliffs, defended by devoted warriors and inhabited by some of the last perfect ones of the Cathar faith, Montségur became the final great symbol of Cathar resistance. The castle itself was not large or luxurious. It was a functional military fortress, built for defense rather than comfort. The keep measured perhaps 100 feet by 60 feet. The walls enclosed a small courtyard and several buildings where the garrison and the religious community lived. Water came from cisterns that collected rainwater. Food came from villages in the valleys below, carried up the mountain by supporters willing to make the difficult climb. But within those modest walls lived an extraordinary community. By the early 1240s, Montségur housed the Cathar Bishop of Toulouse, Bertrand Marty, and perhaps 150 other perfect ones, both men and women. There were also knights and soldiers, about 100 or so, who defended the fortress. And there were believers, families who had come to live under the protection of the castle, close to the perfect ones they revered. For these people, Montségur was not just a fortress but a kind of spiritual refuge, perhaps the last place in the Languedoc where the Cathar faith could be practiced openly. The perfect ones conducted services, administered the consolamentum, taught believers. The community lived according to Cathar principles as much as possible, given the constraints of a fortress under constant threat. Life in Montségur must have been difficult. The winters at that altitude were harsh, with deep snow and freezing winds. Supplies were limited. The constant awareness that they were besieged, if not by armies, then by the implacable hostility of the church, must have been psychologically wearing. Yet the community persisted, bound together by faith and by the conviction that what they were doing mattered. The political situation in the Languedoc had shifted significantly by the 1240s. After Simon de Montfort's death in 1218, his son Amalric had proven unable to hold his father's conquests. Gradually, the native nobility had recovered much of their territory. Raymond VII, son of Raymond VI, had reclaimed Toulouse and much of his father's lands. But Raymond VII was pragmatic. He understood that continued resistance to the church was futile in the long run. In 1229, he had made peace with King Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis, and with the church. The Treaty of Meaux Paris required Raymond to actively suppress heresy in his territories, to cooperate with the Inquisition, and to marry his daughter to the French king's brother, ensuring that when Raymond died without a male heir, Toulouse would pass to the French crown. This treaty marked the end of armed resistance by the major nobility. The Crusade, as a military campaign, was essentially over. The Languedoc was being absorbed into the French kingdom, but the treaty also meant that the Cathars lost their most powerful protectors. Raymond VII was now obligated to persecute them, however reluctantly. Montségur became an anomaly, a place outside the new order. The church and the French authorities increasingly saw it as an intolerable affront. It was not just that heretics lived there. It was that they lived there openly, defiantly, as if the Crusade and the Inquisition had never happened. The event that sealed Montségur's fate occurred in May 1242. A group of knights from Montségur, led by Pierre Roger de Mirepoix, descended from the mountain and ambushed a party of inquisitors at the town of Avignonnet. The inquisitors, including two particularly zealous and hated officials named William Arnaud and Stephen de Saint-Thibéry were holding a tribunal. The knights broke into the house where they were staying and killed them all. The inquisitors, their assistants, their guards, perhaps a dozen men in total. This act of violence was unprecedented. Assassinating papal inquisitors was not just murder, but sacrilege, striking at the very authority of the Church. The Church's response was predictable and overwhelming. Montségur must be destroyed. The fortress that harbored the killers, that sheltered heretics, that defied the Church's authority, would be reduced to rubble, and its inhabitants punished with the full severity of ecclesiastical law. The siege of Montségur began in May 1243, almost exactly a year after the massacre at Avignon. The royal army, acting on the orders of the French king and the Church, surrounded the mountain. They established camps, brought up siege engines, prepared for what they knew would be a long, difficult siege. The task was formidable. Montségur's position made conventional siege tactics difficult. Siege engines could not easily be brought to bear on the walls. The single approach path was too narrow and steep for massed assaults. The defenders could rain arrows and stones down on anyone trying to climb. And the garrison was experienced and determined, willing to fight to the end. The siege settled into a stalemate that lasted through the summer and into the autumn and winter. The besiegers tried to cut off supplies, but the defenders had stockpiled food. They tried bombardment, but their siege engines were firing uphill at extreme range and did little damage. They tried assaults, but these were beaten back with heavy casualties. Inside the fortress, the community maintained its routines as best it could. The perfect ones continued their services. The defenders rotated on watch duty. Children played in the courtyard, somehow managing to find joy even in the shadow of siege. Supplies were rationed carefully. Everyone knew that time was against them, but they had faith that they were where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to do. The breakthrough for the besiegers came in December 1243. A team of climbers, including experienced mountaineers from the nearby region, managed to scale the cliffs on the eastern side of the mountain under cover of darkness. It was an extraordinary feat, climbing nearly sheer rock faces in winter conditions. But they succeeded, reaching a position where they could set up a siege engine that could fire directly into the fortress. From that point, the situation for the defenders became increasingly hopeless. The bombardment took its toll on the walls and buildings. Defenders were killed or wounded. The psychological pressure of knowing the fortress was no longer impregnable wore on everyone. Supplies began to run low. The winter cold made everything worse. Yet the siege continued for another 4 months. The defenders fought on, not because they believed they could win, but because surrender meant death for the perfect ones, and probably for many of the defenders as well. As long as they held out, they were free. Surrender meant the end of everything. In March 1244, after 10 months of siege, the defenders finally negotiated terms of surrender. The soldiers and ordinary believers would be allowed to go free if they confessed their errors to the Inquisition and accepted penance. But the perfect ones must either renounce their faith or face execution by burning. The siege officially ended on March 15, 1244. A 15-day truce was arranged to allow for final preparations. During these 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. Rather than renouncing their faith to save their lives, several believers asked to receive the consolamentum, knowing it would condemn them to death. They chose to die as perfect ones, rather than live by betraying their beliefs. On March 16, 1244, the day after the truce expired, more than 200 perfect ones, men and women, young and old, descended from Montségur for the last time. They walked down the narrow mountain path, past the soldiers who had besieged them, toward a field at the base of the mountain where a large wooden palisade had been erected and filled with stakes and kindling. They were offered one final chance to recant. Not one accepted. They embraced each other, spoke final words of encouragement and faith, and walked into the enclosure. The wood was lit. The flames rose. More than 200 people burned alive that day. The site is still called the Prat dels Cremats, the Field of the Burned. A stone memorial stands there now, marking the place where the last great community of Cathars chose death over submission. The witnesses reported that the perfect ones sang as the flames rose, that they showed no fear, that some appeared to be praying or meditating even as the fire consumed them. Whether this was true or propaganda from believers who wanted to remember them as martyrs, we cannot know. But it became part of the legend of Montségur, the story of ultimate faith and ultimate sacrifice. Among those who died was Bertrand Marty, the Cathar bishop of Toulouse, effectively the head of the Cathar Church. His death symbolized the end of the organized Cathar hierarchy. There would be no more public bishops, no more councils, no more established structure. The church had been decapitated. But Catharism did not end at Montségur. Even as the flames burned, even as 200 perfect ones died, the faith lived on. Because on the night before the surrender, 4 perfect ones, 2 men and 2 women, escaped from the fortress. They climbed down the cliffs in darkness, carrying with them the money and treasures of the Cathar Church, and disappeared into the mountains. What happened to them? Where did they go? What became of the treasures they carried? These questions have fueled speculation and legend for centuries. Some say they went to Catalonia, where Cathar communities still existed. Some say they hid the treasures in caves in the Pyrenees. Some imaginative writers have even claimed they carried the Holy Grail, weaving Cathar history into Arthurian legend. We will never know the truth. What we do know is that Catharism continued after Montségur, though as a shadow of what it had been. A few perfect ones remained in hiding. Believers still practiced in secret. The Inquisition would continue finding and prosecuting Cathars for another 80 years. But Montségur was the end of Cathar hopes for survival as a public faith. The fortress had been the symbol of resistance, the proof that the faith could endure despite persecution. When it fell, when the perfect ones walked into the flames, when the mountain was empty except for ghosts and memories, the Cathars knew that their time in this world was ending. Perhaps in accordance with their beliefs, this was not tragedy but liberation. Perhaps the souls of those who burned were finally freed from the prison of flesh, finally returning to the realm of light they had always sought. Perhaps the fall of Montségur was not a defeat but a victory, the ultimate proof that the material world was indeed evil and corrupt, and that only in death could the spirit be free. Or perhaps they were simply people who believed something different, who wanted to worship God in their own way, who committed no crime except refusing to submit to a power that demanded absolute uniformity. Perhaps they were simply victims of the oldest human story, those who are different being destroyed by those who cannot tolerate difference. The sun set on Montségur on March 16, 1244, and when it rose the next morning, the fortress stood empty. The fires had burned down to ash. The soldiers began to disperse. The inquisitors made their notes and departed. The mountain remained, indifferent to human drama, as mountains always are. And in caves and hiding places across the Languedoc, the last Cathars heard the news and wept and prayed, and wondered how much longer they could endure. Chapter 13. The Underground Years. After Montségur fell, Catharism entered its final phase. A slow decline spread across decades, as the last perfect ones died or were captured, as the remaining believers aged and passed away without successors, as the faith that had once flourished openly in the Languedoc became a hunted secret known to fewer and fewer people. These final years, roughly from 1245 to 1325, are documented primarily through Inquisition records. The tribunals continued their patient work, interrogating suspected heretics, gathering testimonies, following threads of information that sometimes stretched back decades. These records provide us with an extraordinary, if biased, window into how the Cathar faith survived underground. The pattern that emerges is one of small, scattered communities struggling to maintain traditions that were becoming increasingly difficult to practice. Without the public structure of bishops and organized perfect ones, without safe places to gather, the faith became more personal, more improvised, more dependent on individual commitment than on institutional support. Consider the story of Pierre Autier and his brother Guillaume, which the Inquisition records preserve in considerable detail. Pierre was a notary in the town of Aix-les-Thermes in the early 1290s, 50 years after Montségur. He was a successful, respectable man, Catholic as far as anyone knew. But in his family, memories of the Cathar faith had been preserved across generations. His grandmother had known perfect ones. His parents had been believers. Around 1296, Pierre and Guillaume made a remarkable decision. They would travel to Italy, where a few Cathar communities still existed, and seek to be ordained as perfect ones. They would then return to the Languedoc and attempt to revive the faith. They succeeded in receiving the consolamentum and being trained in Cathar theology and practice. Then they returned to the Languedoc and began to secretly minister to the remaining believers. They traveled by night, moving between safe houses, administering the consolamentum, preaching to small groups. For more than a decade, Pierre and Guillaume Autier led a revival of Catharism. They trained new perfect ones. They re-established networks of believers. They demonstrated that the faith was not quite dead, that it could still attract adherents even after a half-century of persecution. But the Inquisition was watching. Through its network of informants and its patient interrogations, it gradually identified the Autier brothers and their network. Between 1305 and 1310, the Inquisition arrested most of the revived Cathar community. Pierre Autier was captured in 1309 and burned at the stake in April 1310, still refusing to recant, still maintaining his faith to the end. His death marked the effective end of organized Catharism. There would be a few more perfect ones in the following years, but no more organized revivals, no more missionaries, no more bishops. The church that had once challenged Catholic orthodoxy across the Languedoc was reduced to scattered individuals, each isolated, each hunted, each knowing they were probably the last. The Inquisition records from these years reveal the extraordinary lengths to which believers went to practice their faith. Secret meetings were arranged through coded messages. The consolamentum was administered hurriedly, in cellars or forest clearings, with lookouts posted to warn of approaching danger. Cathar books, increasingly rare, were hidden in walls or buried in fields, to be retrieved for brief study sessions and then hidden again. The testimonies also reveal how the faith was changing as it was driven deeper underground. Cut off from formal theological training, separated from any established authorities, believers developed variations in practice and belief. Some maintained the strict dualism of traditional Catharism. Others softened it, developing beliefs that were somewhere between Cathar and Catholic. Some retained detailed knowledge of the faith's history and theology. Others knew only fragments, passed down as family traditions whose original context was half forgotten. One of the most remarkable sources from this period is the register of Jacques Fournier, the Bishop of Pamiers, who conducted an inquisition from 1318 to 1325. Fournier was extraordinarily thorough, asking detailed questions about people's lives, beliefs, relationships, and actions going back years or decades. His register, which survives largely intact, provides an intimate portrait of a community under persecution. We meet people like Béatrice de Planisol, a minor noblewoman who had been casually sympathetic to Catharism, who had affairs with various men including a priest, whose complicated life was laid bare in testimony that reads like a medieval novel. We meet shepherds who carried messages between Cathars while tending their flocks in the mountains. We meet priests who secretly sympathized with heresy. We meet believers who struggled with doubt, who wondered if the risks were worth it, who tried to find ways to maintain their faith while not endangering their families. These testimonies remind us that religious persecution affects ordinary people living complicated lives, not just heroes and martyrs. Most people are not capable of walking into fire for their beliefs. Most people try to find compromises, ways to survive with their consciences and their families intact. The Inquisition records show us these struggles with sometimes painful clarity. Jacques Fournier would later become Pope Benedict XII. His thoroughness as an inquisitor was legendary, and it essentially finished what remained of Catharism in the Ariège region. After his Inquisition, there were almost no Cathars left to prosecute. The last recorded burning of a Cathar perfect one occurred in 1321, when Guillaume Bélibaste was captured and executed. Bélibaste was probably the last perfect one in the Languedoc, perhaps the last anywhere. His death, more than 70 years after Montségur, finally ended the line of initiated perfects that had stretched back to the early days of the movement in the 12th century. But even after the perfect ones were gone, some believers remained. People who remembered the faith, who taught their children about it, who practiced what they could without ordained leaders to guide them. The Inquisition continued finding and prosecuting such people into the 1320s and beyond, though by then many of these Cathars knew only fragments of the original faith. One of the last recorded cases involved a family in Montségur, a remote mountain village that had been a center of Cathar belief. In 1324, 4 years after Guillaume Bélibaste's death, the Inquisition arrested and prosecuted believers in Montségur who had been teaching their children about Cathar beliefs, maintaining traditions that their grandparents had learned from actual perfect ones decades before. These people knew they were practicing a dead faith, that there were no more perfect ones to administer the consolamentum, that the organized church was gone. But they persisted anyway, out of family loyalty, out of conviction, out of stubbornness. And eventually, the Inquisition found them too. By 1330 or so, Catharism in the Languedoc was effectively extinct. No perfect ones remained. The believers who survived had either genuinely converted to Catholicism or had hidden their beliefs so deeply that they could not practice them in any meaningful way. The Inquisition, having eliminated the organized heresy, gradually shifted its attention to other matters. The faith that had once challenged the Catholic Church, that had inspired thousands to seek a purer form of Christianity, that had created a culture of tolerance and questioning in the Languedoc, was gone. It had taken more than a century to destroy it completely, but the Church had succeeded. The Cathars had been erased, their books burned, their traditions suppressed, their memory condemned. Or so the Church thought. But memory is more persistent than institutions realize. While the Cathars as a living faith were dead, the story of the Cathars survived. It survived in family memories, in local legends, in the ruins of castles like Montségur that still crowned their mountain peaks, in the place names like the Field of the Burned that preserved the memory of martyrdom. It survived in the archives of the Inquisition itself, in the meticulous records that had been created to destroy heresy, but which preserved detailed information about Cathar belief and practice. Inquisitors like Jacques Fournier had documented the very thing they sought to eliminate, creating historical sources that would allow future generations to recover the story they tried to suppress. And it survived in the historical memory of the Languedoc itself, in the collective consciousness of a region that had been conquered, occupied, and forcibly integrated into the French kingdom. The destruction of the Cathars became part of a larger story about the loss of independence, the suppression of a distinctive culture, the imposition of northern French power on the south. For hundreds of years, this memory remained mostly local, fragmentary, semi-legendary. But it never completely disappeared. And in the 19th century, when Romantic nationalism and interest in medieval history revived, scholars began to rediscover the Cathars, to study the Inquisition records, to reconstruct the story of the heresy and its persecution. What they found was both more complex and more moving than the simple legends. They found not a unified heretical movement, but a diverse collection of beliefs and practices. They found not superhuman martyrs, but ordinary people trying to make sense of their spiritual lives. They found not a simple story of good versus evil, but a tragedy in which sincere, devout people on both sides caused and suffered terrible things. The underground years of Catharism, those final decades when the faith slowly died, reveal both the strength and the weakness of religious movements built on personal conviction rather than institutional power. The strength was resilience. Without churches or property or official status, Catharism persisted for generations through the commitment of individuals. The weakness was fragility. Without institutions to preserve and transmit the tradition, it eventually faded when the last generation of believers died. But perhaps, in accordance with Cathar theology, this was exactly as it should be. The Cathars taught that institutions, buildings, material things were all part of the corrupt physical world. What mattered was the spiritual truth, the divine spark within each person, the knowledge that this world was not home. If the church disappeared but the truth remained, perhaps that was enough. The sun set on the underground years of Catharism. The last believers died. The last memories of meeting perfect ones faded from living minds. The mountain paths that secret pilgrims had walked became overgrown. The safe houses where fugitive perfects had hidden were forgotten. But the mountains remained, and the stones of the castles remained, and somewhere in the archives the records remained. And when the time came, when people were ready to remember and understand, the story of the Cathars would emerge from the shadows into the light of historical understanding. But that too is in the future. For now, in the early 14th century, there is only silence where once there had been preaching. There is only conformity where once there had been questioning. There is only the Catholic Church where once there had been an alternative. The Cathars had dreamed of a purer Christianity, of a faith free from corruption and worldliness. They had created a spiritual movement that attracted thousands, and they had been crushed by the full weight of medieval Christendom, destroyed so thoroughly that for centuries it seemed they had never existed at all. But memory is stubborn, and truth, like water, eventually finds its way through stone. Chapter 15. Echoes through the centuries. The story of the Cathars did not end when the last perfect one died or when the last believer was interrogated. In a sense, the story was just beginning, a new chapter, a chapter about memory, about how persecution is remembered, about how suppressed histories eventually resurface. Ancient manuscripts in modern archive, historians studying texts, past and present, connecting. For several centuries after the final elimination of Catharism, the Cathars existed primarily as a footnote in theological treatises and as a justification for the Inquisition. Catholic writers used them as an example of dangerous heresy, a warning about what happened when people strayed from orthodox belief. The Cathars were, in this narrative, villains who had threatened Christian society and had been rightly suppressed for the good of souls and social order. But in the Languedoc itself, memory persisted in other forms. Local traditions remembered the good Christians, the perfect ones who had been kind and gentle. Folk stories circulated about hidden treasures in mountain caves, about castles that had heroically resisted, about martyrs who had died singing in the flames. These memories were often confused, mixing fact with legend, but they kept the Cathar story alive in popular consciousness, even as official history dismissed or condemned them. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought new attention to the Cathars. Protestant polemicists, seeking historical precedents for resistance to Catholic authority, pointed to the Cathars as proto-Protestants, as early reformers who had recognized the corruption of the Catholic Church and had paid with their lives. This interpretation was historically dubious. Cathar theology had little in common with Protestant belief, but it served a rhetorical purpose, establishing a tradition of anti-Catholic resistance. Catholic apologists responded by emphasizing the theological errors of the Cathars, their dualism, and their rejection of fundamental Christian doctrines. The Cathars became, in the religious conflicts of the Reformation era, symbols that both sides could use. Proof of Catholic tyranny for Protestants, proof of the dangers of heresy for Catholics. During the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the Cathars were rediscovered by philosophers critical of religious intolerance. Voltaire and others wrote about the Albigensian Crusade as an example of religious fanaticism and persecution. They saw the Cathars not as theological exemplars, but as victims of intolerance, martyrs to freedom of thought. This narrative, like the Protestant one, was somewhat ahistorical, but it established the Cathars as symbols of resistance to religious oppression. The real scholarly rediscovery of the Cathars began in the 19th century. Romantic nationalism, which sought to recover the distinctive histories of different regions, led historians in the Languedoc to study their region's medieval past. They began to examine the Inquisition archives, to study the Crusade chronicles, to piece together the story of the Cathars from original sources. What they found was more complex and more moving than the legends. They found detailed testimonies from real people describing their beliefs and practices. They found accounts of the crusade that revealed its brutality. They found evidence of a sophisticated culture that had been destroyed. The Cathars emerged not as mythical heroes or villains, but as historical people with a distinctive faith who had been persecuted into extinction. This scholarly work coincided with the rise of regional identity in the Languedoc, which increasingly saw itself as culturally distinct from northern France. The destruction of the Cathars became part of a broader historical narrative about the conquest and oppression of the south by the north. The Albigensian Crusade was reinterpreted not primarily as a religious conflict, but as a war of conquest, an early example of French imperialism crushing local autonomy. This political interpretation had some validity. The Crusade did result in the political absorption of the Languedoc into the French kingdom, but it sometimes overshadowed the religious aspects of the conflict. The Cathars became symbols of resistance and independence, their actual religious beliefs sometimes secondary to their symbolic role. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, the Cathars attracted attention from various esoteric and occult movements. Some groups claimed spiritual descent from the Cathars, or saw them as possessors of secret wisdom. The legend of the Cathar treasure, supposedly hidden when Montségur fell, became entangled with legends about the Holy Grail. Writers created elaborate theories connecting the Cathars to everything from ancient mystery religions to extraterrestrial visitors. These esoteric interpretations have little historical foundation, but they demonstrate the powerful hold that the Cathar story has on the imagination. There is something compelling about a persecuted faith, about hidden wisdom, about martyrs who chose death over betrayal. The Cathars became, in the popular imagination, carriers of secret truths that the Catholic Church had tried to suppress. Academic historians have worked to separate fact from legend, using rigorous source criticism to reconstruct what we can actually know about Cathar beliefs and practices. This scholarly work has produced a much clearer, if less romantic, understanding of who the Cathars were. We now know that they were not proto-Protestants, not keepers of ancient mysteries, not anything other than medieval dualist Christians who developed a distinctive theology and were persecuted for it. Modern Academic Conference, historians discussing Cathar history, serious scholarly work. Yet even as scholars demythologize the Cathars, the historical reality remains powerful. The Cathars genuinely did challenge the Catholic Church's authority. They genuinely did offer an alternative vision of Christianity. They genuinely did suffer terrible persecution. And they genuinely did show extraordinary courage in maintaining their faith despite that persecution. The sites associated with the Cathars have become important landmarks in the Languedoc. Montségur is now a tourist destination, with thousands of visitors each year climbing the mountain to see the fortress ruins and the memorial at the Field of the Burned. The castle ruins throughout the region, Caribous, Pérepertus, Termes, Puy-Laurent, are preserved as historical monuments. The story of the Cathars has become central to the region's historical identity and tourist economy. In modern times, the Cathars have also attracted interest from people seeking alternatives to mainstream Christianity. Some have attempted to revive Cathar beliefs and practices, creating neo-Cathar groups. These groups are not historical continuations of medieval Catharism. That chain was definitively broken in the 14th century, but rather modern reconstructions based on scholarly understanding of what the Cathars believed. The question of whether Catharism could or should be revived is interesting. On one hand, we have substantial information about Cathar beliefs from the Inquisition records. On the other hand, that information was gathered by enemies of the Cathars, filtered through hostile interrogation, and recorded for the purpose of condemnation. We can never fully recover what it felt like to be a Cathar, to experience the faith from within, rather than viewing it through the lens of persecution. Montségur Castle ruins today, tourist walking paths, modern pilgrims to historical site. Moreover, the Cathar faith was profoundly rooted in its historical context, in medieval cosmology, in the political and social circumstances of the 12th and 13th century Languedoc, in the specific challenge to medieval Catholicism. Attempting to transplant those beliefs into the modern world necessarily transforms them into something different. Yet the appeal is understandable. The Cathars represented a form of Christianity that was simpler, less compromised by worldly power, more focused on spiritual rather than material concerns. Their emphasis on nonviolence, on gender equality in spiritual matters, on personal spiritual development rather than institutional obedience, these values resonate with many modern seekers. The Catholic Church's official stance on the Cathars has evolved over the centuries. For most of the medieval and early modern period, the Cathars were simply condemned as heretics who had been rightly suppressed. But in recent decades, there has been some acknowledgement of the injustices committed during the Albigensian Crusade. In 2000, Pope John Paul II issued a general apology for historical sins committed by the Catholic Church, which included the persecution of heretics, though he did not specifically mention the Cathars. This limited recognition reflects a broader shift in Catholic theology toward religious tolerance and acknowledgement of past errors. The Church that once burned heretics now advocates for religious freedom. The institution that created the Inquisition now condemns torture and forced conversion. This evolution is significant, though it comes too late for the Cathars and countless others who suffered from religious persecution. The legacy of the Cathars extends beyond religious history into broader discussions about tolerance, diversity, and the dangers of absolutism. The story of how an alternative form of Christianity was systematically destroyed serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions cannot tolerate dissent, when difference is seen as dangerous rather than enriching. Modern interfaith gathering, diverse religious representatives, values of tolerance and dialogue. In this sense, the Cathars have become symbols for something larger than their specific historical existence. They represent all the roads not taken, all the alternative possibilities that were foreclosed by violence, all the voices that were silenced, but whose echoes can still be heard if we listen carefully. The Inquisition thought it had erased the Cathars, had eliminated their heresy so completely that it would be forgotten. But by documenting them so thoroughly, by keeping such detailed records of interrogations and testimonies, the Inquisitors inadvertently ensured that the Cathar story would survive. The archives meant to justify persecution became the sources for historical recovery. This is one of history's great ironies. The institution that tried hardest to destroy the Cathars is the same institution that preserved the information necessary to remember them. The meticulous, bureaucratic thoroughness of the medieval Inquisition, intended to root out heresy completely, instead created a detailed historical record that allows us, centuries later, to understand and appreciate what was lost. The Cathars are gone. The last perfect ones died 700 years ago. Their books were burned, their churches destroyed, their castles emptied. As a living faith, Catharism is extinct. But as a historical memory, as a story about courage and persecution, as a symbol of resistance to tyranny, the Cathars have achieved a kind of immortality. Their story is told in books and documentaries. Their castles are visited by tourists. Their memory is honored by scholars. And in the Languedoc, in the land where they lived and died, their presence is still felt. In the names of places, in the ruins on hilltops, in the stories that grandparents still tell grandchildren about the time when the good Christians walked these hills and preached about liberation from the world's suffering. The Cathars believed that this material world was temporary, that suffering would end, that the spirit would ultimately be free. They proved the first part of that belief through their own suffering and destruction. Whether they were right about the rest, about the survival of the spirit beyond matter, about the ultimate return to divine light, remains, as it must, a matter of faith rather than history. But what history can tell us is that they lived according to their beliefs, that they faced terrible persecution with remarkable courage, that they offered an alternative vision that challenged the most powerful institution in their world, and that even though they were destroyed, even though their faith was eliminated, their story survived to challenge and inspire people in ages they could never have imagined. The echoes of the Cathars continue through the centuries, fainter perhaps than the original voices, distorted by time and interpretation, but still audible to those who listen. And in those echoes, we can still hear the questions they asked, the alternatives they represented, and the price they paid for believing differently in a world that demanded conformity.